This week's episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 19th of January 2022 at home in Wicklow. And it was a difficult episode to record, not from a technical point of view, that was easy, but thematically. The focus of the episode was the debate around masculinity and the debate around male violence towards women as an expression of toxic masculinity. And this is a debate that has been raging in Ireland in the last week after the murder of a young woman while she was out running just a week ago. I wanted to reflect on what had happened and reflect on the debate and the vast exchange of opinions around where masculinity is at and how women feel unsafe. And I just wanted to try and contribute something useful, I hope, to the conversation from a male point of view without being tone deaf and without invalidating the genuine and justified fear that many women are experiencing. So this episode goes to that place. It has relevance not just for people in Ireland, but I think everywhere. And I try to keep it in a safe space in terms of what I discuss, and I try to make it coherent. It's up to you to decide whether I have done that or not. But I think I've had a good look at it, and I think I've offered up something accessible and thought-provoking and considered, and as I said, hopefully of use. So that's what's coming up. I don't know if you could say it's something to look forward to exactly, but I think it is something important. I think hopefully it's something that is of interest to you, and I do think it's very relevant if we want to go forward with a better sort of understanding of how genders interact with each other and how masculinity is being viewed at this moment. Okay, I'll talk to you real soon. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind, keep my mojo.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome. How are you today? Just take a beat. Check in with yourself. Check that emotional pulse, that psychological pulse. Check your actual pulse, just to make sure you're still alive, you're still with us. I'm going to try to avoid my usual meandering, my usual meandering and dropping in little moments from my week to begin this episode, because I sort of want to get right into the meat of it, and I just want to try and be present and contribute to a very difficult conversation that's happening in Ireland at the moment, but is a conversation that is relevant anywhere men and women coexist, which the last time I checked was this entire planet. And this entire history of human existence. So I have to begin at the beginning of the catalyst for this conversation. So yesterday in Ireland, at the time of recording this podcast, yesterday a young woman was laid to rest. A funeral took place and a woman was buried. She was only 23. Her name was Aisling Murphy, and she was a young woman at the start of her teaching career. She taught first class students, that would be kids around 6 or 7 years of age. She was also a musician, And a week ago today, she went for a run at 4:00 in the afternoon and was murdered. And this horrific crime, this terrible loss of life, this dark and horrific act of violence against a woman has triggered an enormous outpouring of anger and grief across Ireland and across the sort of, my sense is across the sort of the Irish diaspora as well. It's reached sort of Irish people everywhere. It's probably, it has definitely reached our neighbours across the Irish Sea in England, in the United Kingdom. And yeah, it's definitely been a sort of a fuse that has set light to something that has been, I don't know, I mean, has it always been simmering? But it's certainly something that has exploded, and there has been an eruption of discourse and reaction across media and across social media, and I think in relationships, families, partnerships up and down the country. So yeah, that's the narrative. A week ago, a young woman, really in that very early stage of adulthood and career and the beginning of the fulfillment of potential, that woman was alive, and had no reason to believe she wouldn't be alive a week later, but she has been taken, and people close to her, her family, her friends, other loved ones, her colleagues at the school where she worked, her pupils, and then the ripple outwards of anyone who cares about such things, primarily the women of Ireland, and then anyone else who is bothered and concerned by this, and that would include, I can assure you, very many men, a significant majority of men, I would argue, and the range of emotions, feelings of hurt, feelings of loss, grief, anger, maybe even rage, a sense of helplessness, perhaps a sense of frustration, and other emotions I haven't articulated, and other responses and reactions I haven't articulated. And I found myself wondering at the time last week when this news emerged, apart from my initial reaction of, I don't know, I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to say I was shocked. I think, sadly, these crimes happen. They continue to happen. They have happened for years. It's male on female violence. It's male on male violence. Every day it feels like there's never any shortage of stories of incidents like these. So it would be wrong to say I was shocked, but you feel that sort of disappointment. You feel that sadness. When you stop to sort of look at the details of any of these cases, your heart goes out to the people involved. When I say that, I mean, primarily you're thinking about the family members and friends and loved ones of the victim. And I'll return. I'm going to touch on in the podcast some thoughts about maybe how to frame or look at perpetrators of this crime, and how I really want to have a look at the sort of the discourse around this, and to really avoid the sort of zero-sum nature of how a lot of the discourse has been presented. If you're not this, you're that, and the 100% or nothing approach of viewing this. Now, that said, you have to acknowledge within the discourse the emotional context. I mean, last week and still the sort of emotionality and the intensity of feeling around this particular incident informed and fueled a lot of the reaction and response, and that is necessary. It's necessary to find release. It's necessary to vent. It's necessary to, rend garments and pull hair and scream and cry and roar to release that pain and to express it. But it's probably not the time to make decisions. It's probably not the time to make huge assertions of conviction about men. Certainly condemnation of the individual who committed the crime is a very natural starting point. Anyway, look, I don't want to get ahead of myself because I want to sort of explore this properly. I was going to make the point that after I had, digested that news last week, hardly digested, but just, learnt of the incident, and then really I probably got distracted by the reaction more than the incident, and I found myself wondering why that particular murder has shown itself to be such a catalyst at this moment. And I don't know. I mean, I was wondering, is it pandemic related? Like the pandemic has put such pressure on so many of us, and applied such a squeeze on our instinct for connectivity, and it's put such a squeeze on our ability to be socially interactive, to express our social selves in real life. And that's only one aspect of it. Of course, there's been, for many people, a loss of income, a loss of earnings, a loss of, the ability to earn a living. And so there's that pressure is in the mix as well. Ferocious amount of artists, performers, singers, actors, dancers. I mean, the arts have taken a massive hit here in Ireland anyway. But lots of people have been affected adversely. And I think, broadly speaking, there's a real deep fatigue with the implications of COVID, and I haven't even mentioned the people who've actually lost family members to COVID, or who have been prevented from saying their proper farewells, and prevented from being given the opportunity to grieve properly, for people who've been lost because of the pandemic, whether that's been because of restrictions or because of COVID infections themselves. It doesn't really matter. So maybe there is a sense that it's been a bit of a pressure cooker. And I don't know, I was trying to sort of think about it this morning before pressing record, and I was just kind of wondering, this, suddenly this horrific incident happens last week, and it's kind of on top of everything else. Maybe it's just the sense of disgust, or that sense of frustration, the exasperation and the fury, really, to think, all right, so the pandemic has stopped us from doing so many things. It's put a lid on so much activity. It's prevented us from, living normally, whatever that is. But it's prevented us from moving freely, interacting freely, from hitting our usual marks, if you want to put it that way, from living out our normal, our normal lives, whatever that is for you, going to the places you normally go, seeing the people you normally see, and all that's been there, and yet there's still time to kill women. There's still time to hate women. There's still time for a man to wield his power over a woman. And I understand that to just throw this into the conversation, like domestic violence statistics have risen significantly or disturbingly during the pandemic period. I mean, it's part of this conversation, I suppose. But maybe, anyway, the point I'm making is maybe maybe that's why it was a catalyst. It's like, oh my God, really is this, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak. I mean, that's just speculation on my part. I just think it's interesting that at a certain point, there's a response like the one there has been, or maybe it's because it's a young woman, such a young woman, a woman of enormous sort of talent and potential, and someone who is showing great sort of future promise. There's no reason to think she wasn't going to go on and have a long happy career in teaching. Maybe not. Maybe she would have got jaded with it. But yeah. In any case, I know when my wife came home last week, having been in the car and listening to the immediate sort of aftermath and response and reaction to the murder. She came in from work, and this would have been the day afterwards, so Thursday of last week, and I could see immediately she was shook. I could she just looked kind of pale and a little bit sort of haunted by what she'd been listening to, and she had to kind of go straight back out the door to do some other work. And she said, have you do you know what's happened today? And at that point I hadn't really looked into it. I mean, I'd seen a headline the way you see these headlines, and then you move on. I mean, I hadn't been consuming much in the way of media and news that day, but while she was out, I went and kind of checked out what had happened a bit more deeply. And later on that evening, we had a long sort of conversation to sort of I suppose I just felt instinctively that my wife needed to talk and needed to express something around this, and we had what I felt was a really instructive conversation, a very helpful conversation, a very balanced and non-judgmental, non-reactive conversation to try and interrogate our own sort of responses. And I was certainly grateful to I was grateful to my wife and grateful for the person she is, that there was space there to really look at the implications and to look at the the narratives around incidents like this. But I mean, I did ask my wife. I said, what would you like to see? What would you like to see? And because she'd mentioned men need to do something. And I kind of returned to it and said, what would you like to see men doing? And she just, she was kind of stumped for a couple of minutes, and then she said, I just like to hear from men, and I'd like to hear men addressing other men, and men sort of taking ownership. I know this is how I'm phrasing it. I think that's what my wife was expressing, a desire to see men taking ownership of the narrative in a positive way, if that's not too subjective a word, in a proactive way. And what my wife did say, her prediction was, in the following days, she was predicting it's going to be women leading so much of the sort of the public response. It's going to be women leading vigils. It's going to be women making public statements. It's going to be women expressing their concerns and their anger and their exhaustion, their fatigue from, sort of vicariously, reliving these crimes, and vicariously reliving the sort of the sense of victimhood of women. And well, it wasn't a self-fulfilling prophecy, but indeed a few days later, my wife, who's a musician and a music therapist, she did just organise a little informal vigil in our local town, and she just put up a little notice on Facebook the day before, and she said at 4:00 I'll be playing an hour of Bob Dylan songs for anyone who'd like to come and bring a candle and wear a mask and just pay some respect to the memory of Aisling Murphy. And so that happened, and it was what do you say? It was a successful event. I mean, that's the wrong word, but I mean, people came because there was a need to honour Aisling Murphy, a need to mark the moment, a need to stand up and make your presence felt, and a need to go, I do care, and I do want to be a part of this response. So that was a good thing. Just like the vigils all around the country facilitate that kind of community expression of grief, shock, sadness, and they're expressing a care, I would like to think. So all around the country, these vigils, somehow there's an energy that gets redirected to the community of Tullamore, where the crime happened, and hopefully the people there don't feel isolated in their grief. They don't feel uncared for or ignored. And it was interesting to me, just that night, after my wife and I discussed, my wife went to bed, and I just felt like kind of switching off a bit. I wanted to just sit down and watch a movie, and I had been planning to watch Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, but I knew that story centered around the rape of a woman, and I just thought, I just can't be. I just didn't have the head on it. I just felt it felt wrong to go, okay, now I'll sit down and savor this, and instead I chose to watch a documentary, a HBO documentary about Tina Turner, simply called Tina, which was made with her participation, so an authorized documentary, I suppose, and it was actually great. It was something that I found very comforting, and her story is a harrowing one, by the way. If you're not familiar with her story, and the history of her marriage to Ike Turner and the way she was physically and sexually abused in that relationship, the documentary is excellent, I thought, and you just come away. Well, I came away with massive, renewed admiration for Tina Turner, regardless of her music. Although some of her music I like enormously, but my God, she was such a force. When you go back and see those clips from probably her 20s and 30s, around the sort of the 60s, early 70s, I think Beyonce owes her a huge debt. She was formidable and just like electric on stage, like such incredible energy, such beauty, such an amazing singer, such a vibrant force. And then her story really is one of survival. It's one of survival. It's one of resilience. It's one of will. And ultimately it's one of triumph. And she's an old woman now and has had her health issues in recent years. But it's a great arc, her story, and she really did, re-emerge, a phoenix from the flames, if you'll forgive the cliche. And it was a tonic to watch her story that night. The following night, I did watch Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, and I actually thought it was really good, and it was based on a historical episode from the Middle Ages in France, and a sort of a falling out between two lords, gentlemen. Well, one was a squire who got promoted to be a knight, and there was one of his sort of brothers in arms from the field of battle. They were friends, but the friendship became frayed in subsequent years. The friend found favour with a higher up nobleman who favoured him, and to the cost of the other nobleman. And in the end, the friend raped the other guy's wife, and it led to ultimately a court sanctioned duel before the king, and it was the last duel in France, because they had been sort of outdated, not outlawed, but they no longer took place. But the respective combatants in the story are played by Matt Damon and Adam Driver, both two really great, sort of repellent performances. So really it's a nasty film about nasty men, and the woman involved is Jodie Comer, who is the English actress who you might know from Killing Zoe. Is that what it's called? Have I got the right one? Killing Eve? No, Killing Zoe is that other movie. Killing Eve, the series from a couple of years ago. Sandra Oh is in that as well. And she's great. She's a really great presence in the film, and it's presented with that Kurosawa, three person point of view on the narrative, which Kurosawa presented in his movie Rashomon, which also centered around a rape. And so you get each person's version of the narrative, and we're given Jodie Comer's last. And interestingly, Ben Affleck, who's also in the movie, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon wrote the script, but for the third part, which was Jodie Comer's point of view, they got Nicole Holofcener. I struggle to pronounce her name. Holofcener, who's a brilliant female writer and maker of movies, and she wrote that part. So, ultimately, it did feed back to the conversation about power over women, and in that case, it was legal power, because a woman was a man's property. And so when she was raped, her husband felt aggrieved, not her. Like, he wasn't concerned for her well-being, or the slight on her, or the abuse of her, the transgression, the violation. He was concerned about how it looked for him, because she was his property. So someone had done something to his property, and that's how he expressed it. When he found out his wife had been raped, he's like, "Will this man, will this man just not leave me alone and stop doing things to me?" And so, there's been arguments that the dialogue and the script was tailored a bit too much to resonate with the concerns of today, but I welcomed it, and I thought it wasn't incongruous. I thought it was very well acted and worth checking out if you're interested, and I think it does sort of fit in with what we're talking about today. So, in any case, that was how it kind of played out for us chronologically in this household last week. But I sort of want to look now at the discourse that has emerged around male violence, and around misogyny, and how this discourse has sort of played out, in the media here and on social media. And I think, as I said before, I think the discourse has reflected a general trend around, all topics of concern, in society, all around the world. It seems the polarizing nature of public discourse has become this kind of zero-sum sort of dynamic. It's like you're with us or you're against us. You're either, red state, blue state. You're either, horrendously sort of right-wing, / fascist, / intolerant, / bigoted, or you're a woke, identity politics mad, snowflake, liberal, drip, endlessly triggered wussbag. And there doesn't seem to be any in between where the relevant issues are explored with real nuanced interrogation, with with a commitment to sort of transcend the debate, with a desire to transcend the animosity, with a desire to transcend the finger pointing, and everything seems to be sort of linchpinned into a very emotional base, a very emotional kind of plinth or foundation, and it really, it remains terribly sort of unhelpful if we can't sort of escape from that. And it's not to, and you're probably going to hear me do a bit of this as I try to explore this in a healthy way. None of what I'm saying is to invalidate the rightness of that emotion as a first point of response. We are emotional creatures, and we do have feelings, and we do care, and anger is a response, rage is a response, and deep sort of sadness and grief and hurt, these are valid responses. There's no question about that, not at all, and not for a second. But it's sort of using that as then the sort of the currency of righteousness, or as the currency of a moral position. That is dangerous ground, and it really, I think it ultimately leads to dead ends. So I think it's something that can be used in a healthy way to inform a desire to do better, and to inform a desire to understand better ways forward and better pathways out of conflict. And I think I do sort of put this into a context of conflict. So I think maybe, a place to start would be, this idea, of course, like one of the oldest polarities in the existence, in the history of human existence, is the men versus women polarity, the men against women, the women against men idea, and in a way, it's still, I think on a deep level, it still fuels many sort of presumptions and assumptions about gender, and about intentions, about what's going on beneath the surface, about outlook, about psychology, and it's definitely in the mix. But I found myself responding last week, and I've spoken to a couple of male friends about this because I was really interested to hear their take on this, on the murder and on the subsequent reaction, because I found myself initially reacting quite defensively to the all men sort of idea. Like, all men need to look at themselves, all men need to stand up and be responsible for, generational misogyny and generational male violence, and cross-cultural violence against women. And I found myself going, you know what, I don't feel responsible. And thinking, right, am I going to be allowed to say that? And I saw this kind of debate happening on social media, and a lot of we men need to do this and we men need to do that. And I found myself sort of trying to look at myself and go, well, I'm pretty comfortable with my own non-violent, non-misogynistic credentials. I'm pretty comfortable with my track record of being someone who hasn't indulged in behaviour that was ever threatening to women, that was disrespectful to women, that belittled women. I've never harassed women, and that does not mean that I am a misogyny denier. Misogyny exists, it's real, of course. And I mean, I've spoken about this before and I've written about it before, and what people refer to as toxic masculinity and the aspects of toxic masculinity that impact women. I've spoken about that, and I sort of recognised behaviour that would probably be thrown into that category from a very young age, and it was a very instinctive reaction in me that I didn't care for it, and I've always sort of steered myself away from it. And when there's been opportunities to discuss it or express my disapproval of what that behaviour might look like, I've done so, and I've been consistent. And there might be, maybe I'm trying to listen to my own voice here, and I may detect a note of defensiveness, but I'm going to own that. I'm going to own that, because I don't want to be tone deaf, and I don't want to invalidate female rage and female hurt. And I especially don't want to invalidate the position of women feeling afraid, because I can look at this academically and philosophically and historically and psychologically, and try and make clever arguments and present clever frameworks. But none of that changes the fact that many women feel afraid. And I'm very interested in how to be part of making women feel less afraid socially. So I mean, I don't speak for all men. I think that would be grotesque arrogance. I think that would verge on stupidity. I speak for myself. I mean, if you want to reduce it down and go, well, okay, well, who are the men who are closest to me? So from a genetic point of view, I have 3 brothers. So presumably, we're a representative set. But I wouldn't even dare to speak for them. I wouldn't speak for my father. So, and they go, oh, well, maybe I could speak for, the men in my community. So, like, I grew up in County Wicklow, and I grew up in, the area of Rathdrum and Avoca and Ballinaclash. So maybe I can speak for those men. No, it's absurd. And I think, I'm not being disingenuous here, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to throw shade on women who feel solidarity with other women and women who want to speak for their gender and go, we are sick of being, assaulted, objectified, belittled, affronted, negated, disempowered, whatever that conversation might be, whatever that language might look like. I'm not trying to throw shade on that. I'm not trying to invalidate that, but I am owning that I can only speak for myself, and I don't represent all men. That said, I would feel confident the vast majority of my good male friends would, I think, recognise what I'm talking about, would probably feel themselves, and I would certainly feel about them, thinking of them, knowing them, having known some of these guys for over 40 years, that they we're not the type of guys to behave in a misogynistic way, to indulge in any of that sort of behaviour. That hasn't been my experience of those men, and I certainly haven't felt that the women in their lives have given any indication that they're that type of man. So this idea that, all men, are a certain way, it doesn't hold a lot of water in my experience. I think there are bad men out there. I think there are violent men out there. I think there are misogynistic men. I think there are sexist men. Although I think, could we make a distinction between misogyny and sexism? There is a distinction there, isn't there? What is sexism? Reducing someone to aspects of their gender and not allowing them to be a fully fleshed out human being. Certainly, I think sexual objectification would fall in there. But does that equate to a hatred of women? I mean, I find that a far more sinister idea. That women are a natural enemy of men. That's not my experience. And it's never been my experience. I mean, and I've listened to, just let's for a second look at this whole idea of toxic masculinity. I mean, I do believe that there is a feminine equivalent. Like, there's a toxic femininity that directs a sort of a reductive frame of men and speaks very freely about men being, emotionally inadequate. I think when women infantilize men, that is a version of toxic femininity, and there's, I can remember as a probably, teenager, an older teenager in my early 20s even, there were plenty of, young women that I knew that would liberally trash men and go, men only think with their private parts. They're driven by their sex drives, their libidos. All men are bastards. That I never stopped hearing that. But I never came away from those conversations thinking all women think this way. I remember walking away from those conversations thinking, well, that woman thinks that way, or that girl thinks that way. And I always went forward in the belief that there's going to be other women out there who like men and haven't become so cynical. And I feel I was very lucky that I had relationships with several of those women who didn't hate men, and they didn't hate me. Not at the start of the relationship anyway. And if they did hate me, it wasn't because I was a misogynist. It was probably because I was immature. And, I think there has been a conflation, perhaps, of male immaturity and a conflation of the narrowness of the male sort of view of women, and a sort of a conflation of the sort of the casual sexism, and sometimes a version of sexism that men trade in, that's part of a sense of humor, that is part of a male. So I think it is. There is an aspect of that's part of sort of male bonding, but the male friends that I referred to earlier, I feel that if we ever adopt that position, we're sort of in on the joke. That I wouldn't make that joke with someone who I didn't intuitively sense was someone who was very respectful of women, someone who cared for women, someone who saw women as equals, and to suggest otherwise would be utterly preposterous. And so then a sexist jibe or a sexist joke becomes, that's why it becomes funny, because there is no dark agenda underpinning it. And I believe that to be the case. I'm not trying to soften the larger implications of sexism, but don't tell me, if you're a female listener, don't tell me that it doesn't flow the other way, that women can't make jokes about men based on their gender. So the point I was going to make is that I think there's been a conflation of aspects of masculinity. There's been a conflation of aspects of male behaviour. There's been a conflation of certain gendered behaviour in men, and it's been conflated with extreme violence and extreme sexual predation. So if we're talking about, battery, murder, rape, and that gets conflated with a sexist joke, or it gets conflated with, the male gaze, I think that's treacherous territory. And I think that is a disingenuous position. I think there's a spectrum of, less savoury male behaviour, bad male behaviour, masculinity that we don't approve of. And, misogyny is there on that scale. And I think extreme acts of violence are way up at, the far end of that scale, very far removed from the experience of most men. And that's something I think that needs to be acknowledged, without saying all other men are angels, or all other men are great guys, or all other men always have women's backs. I mean, that would be totally naive to talk like that. But that's what I mean about the zero-sum idea, either this or that. It's not the case. Men are complex individuals, so are women. This is what we need to be looking at. And again, I can't stress quickly enough, when we get bogged into this conversation, it seems to move very far away from the reality of a young woman got murdered last week. And I don't want us to lose sight of the tragedy of that, the import of that, the resonance of that. But as I said earlier, I'm interested in, what is this conversation that needs to be had? Because if there's a young man who has a leaning towards psychopathology, towards violence, I'm not sure if that guy is going to be reached by a change in rhetoric. I'm not sure if that guy is going to be reached by positive messaging around masculinity. Now, and he may be, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've been a teacher. I've been that teacher who's gone into a classroom and been very aware of my gender and very aware of the types of things that I've been saying around any flashpoints to do with objectification of women, and very aware of who's in front of me. And I certainly brought that awareness into the classroom as a young teacher, and had a look at the role and thought, well, that I think, and to look at the role and go, well, what is my responsibility here? It's not just teach the material. It's not just open the book on page 7. It's not just write down your homework. I always felt going into a classroom that the responsibility is far greater than that, to go, what kind of person are you? And what person are you walking into this space with young minds and young people? What do you have to offer them? And are you don't go in there in a careless, thoughtless way, because you're in a position of authority, you're in a position of influence, you're in a shaping, moulding position, consciously or not, intentionally or not. You have an impact by being there. And that is part of this conversation. And, part of the conversation of, what we see and who we see and the behaviour we see and the messaging we see, how that does shape us. And that feeds into the cultural argument, the argument that culture shapes misogyny. that there's, to quote my cousin here at #blessed, he was referring to some article he read, someone referring to the soup of misogyny, that young men grow up with this misogyny all around, and it shapes their, it's like a breeding ground for misogynists. It's a breeding ground that plants the seeds of hating women. And we were both saying, well, that wasn't our experience. And so if we can give men more credit to kind of go, men have the ability to think for themselves. All men have the ability to think for themselves, and they can make choices, and they can recognize, oh, I find that behavior repellent. I don't like that attitude. I don't like that vibe, that energy. I don't like being a part of that. You can make a choice. And most of the men I know made that choice. And that's not a type of language or an outlook or a behavior that they trade in. And, I think that should be part of the discussion. So, yeah, culturally, I don't know. I mean, I spoke about this. I did an episode on the podcast that was very focused on kind of body shaming, and female body shaming, and female objectification, sexual objectification, and I spoke about this territory before, and I think we are living in an age where the access to objectified images of women has never been greater. And that may or may not be in the mix. So, and this again, if you go back to the sort of the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of sort of cultural debate and fear and arguably hysteria around what were called video nasties, and basically that referred to extremely sort of gory and violent movies, often horror movies or chillers with serial killers and gore, violence, sexual violence, lots of blood, dismemberment, etc. And there was a sort of a social panic around the impact of seeing these movies, video nasties. And I think the research has shown that the idea of causality is pretty unfounded. The idea that seeing these images then causes the viewer, the spectator, the watcher to then go out and commit the sort of the replicable crime in real life. And I'm drawing the connection between the proliferation of objectified imagery of women and the proliferation of pornography and the proliferation of of female beauty in a highly sort of sexualized presentation or mode in popular media, whether that's music videos or whether that's in movies, and even on social media, on Instagram, and that's all out there. But then to kind of go, well, does that turn men into killers? Is that in the mix of presenting an idea of a very reduced one single aspect idea of femininity, highly sexualized, highly physical, highly highly desirable, I suppose, depending on your wiring. Does that make men think? I guess this is the argument. That makes men think, oh well, women are there kind of to be consumed. Women are there to be had. I think that again, maybe in the immature male mind, there's an aspect of that, but the immature male mind matures. It grows, it develops, it evolves, it becomes more informed, it becomes more nuanced. It starts to recognize, oh, that's just that. And you can create that separation. Now, you take that same imagery and maybe you put that into a misogynistic context. And maybe if there's a culture of misogyny and there's a culture of wielding power over women and keeping women in a place, then I think that's getting into sort of toxic territory. And then within that context, if you have someone who has an extreme mental illness and has a sociopathology or a psychopathology or whatever diagnosis it might be, and the combination of elements leads to an act of extreme violence, an act of extreme hatred, that is a distortion of male behavior. Now, a lot of people are arguing it's just the end of the, it's the trickle effect, and ultimately the trickle becomes, a stream becomes a river, becomes a deluge, becomes a tsunami. That is an argument, and I think maybe you'll find a tiny percent that maybe fall into that, but I would argue that tiny percentage are products of extreme, an extreme kind of situation, either familially or socioeconomically, or particularly in terms of, brain chemistry, brain development, perhaps victims of abuse themselves. And when I say abuse, that could just be exposed to, a lot of male violence themselves, being, battered or whatever. I don't know. I'm not, this is not my kind of area of expertise, but that is all in the mix. And if you want to move away from that argument, which I acknowledge there are valid aspects to that, but I think there's a lot of counter evidence that would say it's not definitive and it's not the natural endpoint by any means, and in fact only in the smallest percentage of situations is it a natural endpoint. But there's another argument. If we're talking about, where does male violence come from, there's another argument. If you look at what psychologists say about this, and particularly I found an article where someone was looking at the findings of evolutionary psychologists, and fundamentally they were saying that the whole history of the male animal, human and otherwise, is one of developing to be dominant, developing to compete with threats to property, threats to family, threats to food, whatever it might be. And so the male animal, and so the human animal, a man is evolutionarily set up to be stronger, is evolutionarily set up to be more aggressive, more competitive, and testosterone is a part of that. And I personally feel like when we talk about male violence and female safety, my question is, and I'm not saying this with any satisfaction or pleasure, and I'm not saying it cynically, but are women ever going to be safe from male violence? Really? And I'm not trying to be negative. This is not a doom and gloom dystopian viewpoint, but the male animal is always going to be stronger, broadly speaking. And I do believe that is in the mix when men commit these crimes. One of the reasons, one of the facilitating or what do I want to say? One of the aspects that gives that man the green light, that gives that man permission, is purely the sense of ability. Like, I am able to do this. I can overpower that woman. And that's underneath all of the diseased thinking, the distorted view. That's on top of whatever that man's trauma is. That's on top of the brain chemistry. It's underneath all that. Like that sense deep down that, well, if I chose to be this deranged, if I chose to act out, if I chose to commit this act of violence, if I chose to be a sexual predator, underpinning that speculation or underpinning those kind of dark fantasies is the belief or the conviction that I will be able to act out on this. And in that regard, you could argue that, well, that's probably never going to change, that men will always have that power. I remember watching the second season of True Detective, the much sort of maligned and I think very underrated second season of True Detective, which featured Vince Vaughn. Maybe that casting didn't work that well. I thought a brilliant Colin Farrell. Taylor Kitsch was in that as well. And a great performance, I thought, from Rachel McAdams, who was playing like a homicide detective who was deeply scarred by some childhood experiences, and she was equipped. She always equipped herself with a lethal knife, which she was very adept at using, and she practiced stabbing with great ferocity, like a mannequin, a dummy. And I don't know if it was a male colleague was asking her, is that really necessary? I mean, you're packing a gun as well. And I think her line, fundamentally, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but fundamentally she was saying, I'm going out there into a world when, basically every man is capable of overpowering me. Every man is, this percentage stronger than me. So if I can't get the gun, I need something else that I know is going to protect me and do that damage. And I remember just in the body of her character, like the way it was expressed, the way she tapped into something, just the sort of the reality check wrapped up in her fear, wrapped up in her defiance, wrapped up in her own sense of kind of futility, maybe, although she chose to be a homicide detective, so she was out there making a difference. And there's a very scary sequence later on in the series where she is in a vulnerable place because she's been drugged, and it kind of taps into her, as the audience we tap into her fears because she's expressed them previously. Really good and worth checking out, the second season. So anyway, the kind of the discourse continues, and I think there are, of course, there's nothing but historical precedent for crime against women, for violence against women, for women being, raped and battered and disempowered, for women having no status, for women being a possession of men, the property of men. And we like to think that we have evolved socially, culturally into better times, where women are getting ever more closer to that goal of equality. Now, ever more closer, not there yet. Realistically, if we're talking about wage equality, status equality, but I feel it's happening. I feel the Me Too movement, for all the kind of the complexity of the Me Too movement, its own sort of zero-sum narrative, or the way it was hijacked into being something maybe less nuanced. I feel that that was the start of something. That was a catalytic moment itself, and one which personally, and again, I don't speak for all men, personally, I was not threatened by it, and I still do not feel threatened by it. And I welcome social, economic advancement for anyone who feels that they've been disenfranchised. That's part of the larger conversation. this idea that men don't feel afraid, that men don't go out there in the world with fear, that's also something of there's a word I was looking for there. Anyway, I was going to say a shibboleth, a myth. It's not true. Do you think do you think someone who's done karate for 30 years isn't coming from a place of fear? You know, martial arts attracts people who are fearful. That's why they learn martial arts. That's why they learn self-defense systems. It attracts other people as well. But a huge percentage of people who take up martial arts are doing so because they want to protect themselves. And huge numbers of men start martial arts. The vast majority of my martial arts students are boys. Although I have a couple of female students and I love seeing them rock up. And, there is a discussion to be had about, should we be teaching self-defense in schools? Should that be part of the curriculum? Why wouldn't you want everyone to know how to defend themselves? But my cousin and I were discussing this the other day. We were talking about, do you feel afraid? And he was saying, well, maybe we don't. We don't feel afraid in the same way women do. And I was saying, well, perhaps if we were part of a group, if we're part of a sector of society, if we've been put into a category. So maybe if we're like two white straight guys. So theoretically, we're at the top of the food chain. But maybe if we were two white gay guys, we wouldn't feel so safe because homophobic violence is out there too. Maybe if we were of a certain faith, we might feel that we'd be victims of religious violence. There's probably 50 other different ways you could create subsets and go, they're going to be victimized and they're going to be victimized. But this isn't about those other groups. This particular conversation is about, women and their experience of fear. And there is probably, there's probably another conversation to be had around, to just quickly return to the idea of the historical context and the evolution or not, as the case may be, of social attitudes and gendered attitudes that were cultivated under patriarchal systems and patriarchal structures, and how they've been handed down consciously and otherwise, and that contributes to it contributes to the larger frame of what women, and I'm speaking for women now, but I mean this is what I've read and consumed, what I feel women feel that they're up against, and so if then we're at a moment where what I'm trying to see this as an opportunity for conversation, an opportunity for deepening our understanding across the gender divide, for deepening our understanding of what's not working. And so I was trying to think of it last week, and I was looking at my initial defensive reaction, and I thought, well, hold on a second. If I fundamentally feel I've conducted myself well in the context of this area of gendered violence and misogyny and sexism, then I shouldn't feel the need to defend myself. And so I was trying to view the debate differently and think, okay, so I experience some of this reaction as criticism of men. And if I take that and kind of go, okay, well, if I believe the all men theory, then this criticism hurts me. But I don't believe in the all men theory, therefore I don't have to be threatened by the criticism. I can listen to criticism from a position of strength, from a position of confidence that I've conducted myself well, from a position of security, and from a position of humility. And so the humility part is, even though I think I've done well on a level, that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. That doesn't mean there may be areas of my behaviour that can be criticised, that can be examined more thoroughly. And I think I would, that's what I would offer in this conversation as a starting point to go, well, okay, women are hurt, and I'm not talking about physically hurt. I'm talking like, women, deep down in their sort of their in their psyche, in their sense of selves, and in their sense of solidarity, they're wounded, they're hurt, they've been kicked by yet another one of their sisters being taken. And women want to express their anger, they want to express their frustration, they want to express their rage. And maybe it's a time for men to shut up and listen on one level, to go, well, okay, well, speak, say, what do you want to say? How do you want to say it? And let that venting happen and receive it without judgment. Receive it because it's helpful. It's actually helpful to let the aggrieved party express themselves. It's helpful to them to feel they are being heard. It's helpful to let them express something. And then after that, you can say, well, okay, well, what would you like? How would you like this to play out? How can we go forward in a better way? And I think, because I think there's a danger when we get into that defensive position, and maybe I'm guilty of it already in this podcast. So if, like, I've been listening to toxic masculinity, a phrase which I don't really care for, which I don't think is constructive or valuable. I think there's other ways to talk about that, to talk about the behaviour that ends up being described as toxic masculinity. For me, it's too much of an umbrella term. But I think what can happen with feeling defensive is we get into point scoring. I'll give you an example of this in my own marriage. A couple of weeks ago, I was on the phone at dinner, which is not that common. And my wife was, she was kind of instantly annoyed because my phone was very busy. And for some reason, I'd made the decision that I needed to keep going with a couple of conversations that were about logistics or making plans. And she just kind of hit me with a tone, please, can we have no phones at the table? And I took it defensively. And I felt I was being sort of chastised or reprimanded like a scolded child. And I tried to stop myself. I was kind of sitting on my kind of initial defensive and angry response. And then I said, oh, well, you do this too sometimes, sort of petulantly. And my wife was just like, oh, God. I mean, I could just tell she didn't say it to me, but I could tell she was really annoyed. And I mean, it was me just basically trying to score a point and go, you too, you do this too. And it's like, it actually wasn't helpful in the moment. And afterwards we discussed it with a bit more nuance, and it was all good. And, I was totally in agreement with my wife. So, the way we, and by the way, my wife's a woman and I'm a man. And so I think that's relevant here, because the way we speak to each other, and I'm a big believer in this, the way we speak to each other, how we communicate with each other is really important in terms of resolving conflict, in terms of feeling that there's, a decent base to go forward, that there's a trust that we're being listened to and respected. And let's extend that then to this gendered debate around, men and women. And I think the way we communicate is really important. And, receiving a lot of, I suppose, anger, and there's a lot of sort of accusation in that anger, because there's a lot of hurt behind it. It's to try and receive it without sort of, coming into that kind of pearl clutching position, and being kind of horrified and offended. I mean, not me, I'm not one of those men. It doesn't really contribute much to the conversation at the moment. So instead go, okay, that's what you need to say. Well, let's see what we can do. And I'm going to try and sort of wrap this up in the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes, because there's a few different things I want to sort of look at, which may help sort of flesh this out. And I think, there's three main ideas that I want to look at. And the first is, I want to go back because there's been a lot of talk about, young men, boys, what they're exposed to. And I feel I negotiated a lot of those pitfalls. But let's be real. You're a kid. What the hell do you know? What level of nuance can you bring to bear when you're 5, 6, 7? Not a lot. So I'm just going to give you my own frame in terms of my relationship with the opposite sex. So I feel basically as a kid, my view was first you're like, okay, I'm a boy, that's a girl. And that has no bearing on anything for a while. So it's just you're coexisting there at a very young age in those early play schools and the early classes of education. And they're just your classmates. In my case, classmates, because I went to... what the hell am I trying to say? Co-educational, boys and girls in school, not single-sex schools. So primary and secondary school, that was my experience. So you start off and it's just kind of a bit like, whatever. There's nothing really on the radar. And then you realise, all right, okay, girls are different. Right, okay. So it becomes a bit more explicit. And of course, the most obvious way that expresses itself is in terms of clothes, colours of clothes, perhaps, the sort of the gender stereotyping that happens. What you're interested in, what I'm interested in, what's being laid out here, what you're consuming in your school books. And of course, there's bodies and hairstyles and all the rest. So that kind of, they're the initial exposure. All right, they're different to us, grand. So, but at that point, it's still, there's sort of ignorance. There's ignorance at that young age of maybe the sort of the different wiring or the different thinking or what girls are integrating into their viewpoint, what they've inherited, what's being handed down in terms of how they view boys, the opposite sex, what they're looking at, on TV, how they view female sexuality. So there's a lot of ignorance. And then you get a little bit older and you realise, in my case, being a straight guy, you realise, oh, there's desire. So then you have desire, and that desire starts maybe late primary school and goes right through. And my argument is at that point then you've got desire coupled with ignorance. There's still loads of ignorance. There's all these blank areas. There's the unknown. And you're kind of getting educated in sort of, sex education and biology as a young teenager. And unless, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, I referred to 3 brothers. I didn't grow up with sisters, so my mum was the only woman in the house. So that, of course, would be a limiting factor in being exposed to contemporaries, of the opposite gender. So that was in the mix. But there's desire and ignorance. So then there's this kind of huge desire for the opposite sex, but you've no knowledge and you're completely ignorant. You don't really know how to behave, so you're just kind of finding your way. And with men, that usually involves humour and teasing, provocation, that kind of jostling for attention, because you're trying to, win favour and gain the interest of the girls that you're attracted to. And there might be other ways to attract that attention through, your achievements in sport or in the classroom or, whatever it might be. Your particular hobbies, your skill set. You might be playing music already, whatever. For God's sake, this is really obvious what I'm saying. But there's still ignorance. So then, when do you start to get exposure? So maybe you have your first girlfriend, your first kiss, your first foray, into sort of, a bit of sexual experience. So then you've got desire and exposure. And over time, exposure becomes experience. And that really is the beginning of getting to know the opposite sex. And, again, I'm only speaking for myself, and I'm presuming there's an equivalent from, traveling the other way from female to male, and equivalents for other sexual orientations, if that's in the mix. It doesn't feel as relevant to this conversation today. So then, as you get older again, then what you're doing is you're meeting women. You've still got the the desire, and in my case, that desire for, the relationship, the companionship, the friendship, the desire sexually, the desire for that affirmation of someone that you're attracted to. And then what you're doing is you're bringing that knowledge, and now you've got history. You've got history of other relationships. And there's an evolution. There's an evolution of thought. You're bringing a more sophisticated frame. Again, I shouldn't say I'm talking about myself. I was bringing a more sophisticated frame to my second relationship, my third relationship, my fourth relationship, and to how I met women and viewed women. And as I dealt with my own stuff, as I resolved stuff in myself, I was able to bring better things to my relationships with women. And really that led to ultimately meeting my wife and meeting each other as equals. And that really was the beginning of our connection, having both had relationships, long-term relationships previously that hadn't, ended up the way we wanted. And we sort of met with, a nice level of experience, with a similar sort of view of what we wanted in a relationship, and crucially, huge attraction to each other and sort of a recognition of something in each other. But I would say that was my first relationship to come in feeling equal. So in previous relationships, I either felt, in a much kind of lower place than my partner, or in a sort of a higher place. And those relationships didn't really end, that well. So I'm just trying to put that into the mix of, how we get to know each other, from a gender point of view. And, relationships are very instructive if you're open to learning, if you want to kind of know this person you're spending your life with. So I think that is typically what I still bring to my female friendships. I'm always interested in their perspective, and certainly I use my female friends, in very similar ways to my male friendships. It's all about sort of, being challenged, being informed, sharing the internal life, and they're, my good kind of female friends, they enrich my life no less than my male friendships. So that's one aspect to this. What I'm trying to say is, I feel my experience isn't that rare. I think I know lots of men and they like women in, broadly, not just they like women sexually. Like, women are friends, women are, it is a meeting of equals. And any other option, as I referred to earlier, would be preposterous and absurd and self-harming. Now, I think another strand of this, and I'm jumping here, when I think of this murder that happened last week, and at the end of last week's episode, I referred to the death of Sinead O'Connor's son. Sinead O'Connor, the Irish musician, singer, songwriter, great sort of female kind of icon, I think, and great sort of, truth teller. And I was reflecting on, her terrible loss, and I was speaking about the sadness that a young man who I understand had his history of mental health issues, but that he chose to end his own life. And I spoke about that, and then we had this murder of Aisling Murphy, and I thought, well, all of this, this expression of male violence, this incident of male violence, and a young man a week before killing himself, and there was a gangland murder as well, I think, in the same sort of 7-day period. And I thought, all of these incidents, they're all facets of male crisis, or a crisis in masculinity, because suicide is an act of male violence. When it's a man, of course, women commit suicide also, but that is an act of male violence. And I really feel strongly about this, that there is this, this spectrum of male crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't like this phrase toxic masculinity. I prefer to think of, these versions of masculinity that are really problematic, that are, in the case of Aisling Murphy, absolutely reprehensible and tragic. That these are versions of broken masculinity. These are versions of traumatised masculinity. They're versions of stunted masculinity. And there's a huge range. And I think if we can start viewing what we're referring to as toxic masculinity in these terms, and start to think more empathetically and compassionately around the around the area of male pain, of male of the sources of male anger, of the sources of male frustration, and start thinking very conscientiously and proactively about creating avenues for the healthy release and negotiation and expression of male pain, whether that's in a male-only space, whether it's in a male and female space, whether it's in a community space. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're providing that outlet, if we are validating, and I mean this, and I'm really committed to this idea, to validate male pain, to validate male vulnerability, and to validate the expression of that vulnerability, to validate the expression of that pain, and to allow men of any age to feel there's a space I can go into and be naked, emotionally, psychologically naked, to be vulnerable, to feel it's a safe space to express this. And I think that is a worthwhile social, cultural goal, to go, can we do that for men? Because I think there would be a positive effect. I think there would be an extremely positive knock-on effect for everyone in society, for anyone that man comes in contact with, and especially for people that feel vulnerable around men, and let's just call that and say that's women, and that's children, and that's also other men. So I think that is part of this conversation, and none of that is to deprioritize or delegitimize women's pain. That is not to delegitimize the female experience. That is not to say, hey, we shouldn't be talking about Aisling Murphy. We shouldn't be talking about female victims of male violence. I don't agree with that at all. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that part of this conversation does need to focus on how are we accommodating, male suffering. How are we providing outlets, healthy, supported outlets? And, this should be a social and cultural commitment, and not just something we go, well, the health services will deal with this, or the guards will deal with this. They can't. They're not equipped. The Irish government, for whatever, for a variety of reasons, they haven't found the resources or the political will to really make this happen. And it's the pressure that the great people who work in Irish health services or mental health service, the pressure that they're under is phenomenal. But they're doing the absolute best they can, and they're working in a system at breaking point. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm trying to I'm trying to articulate this. How important it is to really put that in the frame. How are we looking at male suffering, male pain, male crisis, and how are we helping all of us, men and women? And so to sort of conclude, I have this one other idea. I was thinking Because my wife said, I'd like to hear men talking to other men. I'd like to see a crowd of men with a loudspeaker addressing other men. And what would you say to them? And I found myself reflecting on that and thinking, well, for a long time I've been banging my own drum about, trying to be a better man, being very aware of being in a position to be a role model of a type in certain capacities, standing in classrooms, standing in martial arts training settings, addressing young men and young women. I've never, I've always been very conscious of the responsibility of being in that position. And I take that idea that whether I like it or not, I am a representative of the male sex. That's, some men will be judged on my behavior. Assumptions will be made about men based on my behavior in, for better or worse, in good or bad contexts. And I have to accept that and own if I haven't conducted myself well at times. I own it. I put my hand up and say, okay, well, I have to look at that and go, how do I want to go forward? So what I was thinking is, if I was addressing men, this is how I would think of it. And I think I'd be saying to these men, the men of this island, my fellow countrymen and any other man who happens to be living here and working here and living a life here, because they're on this island too, and no less important than, another Irish man. I think the way I'd frame it is, this is our tribe. On this island, where we live, where we're living our lives, this is our tribe. And every woman we meet is in the tribe. And every child we meet is in the tribe. And we are responsible for the wellness of the tribe. We are responsible for the strength of the tribe. We are responsible for the health of the tribe. We are responsible for the happiness of the tribe. We are responsible for the success of the tribe. And we cannot contribute to the destruction of people in the tribe. We cannot stand by and let the women of our tribe be murdered. We cannot stand by and let the women of our tribe be raped. We cannot stand by and let children be violated. Because when we do that, we're hurting the tribe. The entire tribe suffers. And I think women need to know that men suffer too. We suffer when a crime like this happens. Our masculinity takes a beating when a man kills a woman, regardless of what state he's in, or where his head's at, or what his background is. It doesn't matter. It's a stain. And I accept that. I can see how that hurts all men, and how women then view men and think, that's what you're like then, is it? That's what you're capable of. So to my mind, it feels like this very weird time we find ourselves in, this crisis of health with the pandemic, but also in a way this crisis of capitalism, this economic crisis where so many people are feeling shut out, left behind, where the capitalist model fundamentally is you go after your own thing, you pursue your own dream, you look after your own, you chase the dream, you chase the fantasy, you chase those dollars for yourself. That is a part of capitalist ideology, and that has contributed to a fracturing of community. It's contributed to a fracturing of connectivity, and the online world has contributed to that fracturing as well, because we're not interacting with each other for real. We're not interacting with each other in the flesh, where consequences are far more real and far more present and resonant and felt. We dehumanize each other when we're only interacting via our screens and devices and on Instagram and making funny comments here and saying bitchy, smart arse things there. It's all dehumanizing. It's not making us smarter. It's not bringing us closer. It's not deepening our understanding. Quite the opposite. It's alienating us. And so, if you are a man who is willing to accept the idea that maybe the tribe is a good thing, that tribalism, so often used in a negative context, if that can be seen as a very positive thing, that you can stand up and say, I care about the women of this island. I care about any woman on this island because she's part of my tribe. I'm part of her tribe and I want her to feel that guy has my back. And maybe if we all embrace that idea, and ultimately this is all I have to offer, because I can't fix a broken brain. I can't fix psychopathology. I can't fix male violence. But maybe we can go forward and just have a sense of, do you know what? We actually can help women feel safer by standing up and owning a certain responsibility within the tribe, by being willing to stand up and go, there's actually a more honourable way to behave as a man. There's a more honourable way to behave as a member of this tribe. And I want to deserve that respect that I might get. I want to feel that I'm seen as a good man in this tribe and someone who cares about the tribe maybe more than himself. I don't think that's a bad thing. So that's it. That's all I've got for you today. I hope I've contributed in some way to this discussion. I do care about it. I care about how masculinity is perceived. I care about my own role in this. And I care about having better conversations, more nuanced conversations. I care about being heard. I care about being listened to. I care about the exchange between men and women because we're here together. We're living here together. It's happening now. It is real life. There are real consequences. And we can all do better. All of us. So that's it. I'm going to leave you with that. And if you found time to listen to this, I hope it's stimulated something positive in you. And you can share a thought for Aisling Murphy and her family and her pupils and her friends and colleagues. And share a thought for any woman who has suffered at the hands of a man, and spare a thought for the men who have failed to find a better path, for the men who have failed to control their rage, their violence, who have failed to educate themselves, who have failed to value women and failed to protect women from themselves, from the men, I mean, in that case. Okay, that's it. Listen, as always, you can find me on social media. On Instagram, it's the Clear Out Podcast. It's the Clear Out Podcast on YouTube. It's the Clear Out Podcast on Facebook. It's the Clear Out 2, number 2, that is. The Clear Out 2 on Twitter. If you want to leave some comments, I'd love to get some feedback. I'd love to get some love if you're enjoying what you're hearing. And again, if you want to spread some financial love and send some financial love my way, you can do so using the supporter link, which will be in the information where you're listening to this podcast, or the Patreon link if you want to make an ongoing, regular, small donation. That's what keeps these independent podcasts alive. That is patreon.com/theclearout. So there you go. It has been a bit of a long one, but it kind of needed the time. And as I said, I hope I've contributed something positive or thought-provoking to the debate. Okay, mind yourselves, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you real soon. All the best. Good luck. Bye.